Hi everyone. Who came first, Homer or Hesiod? They were both very famous, very important Greek poets early in Greek history, but which one was actually around first? Well, generally speaking, Homer is considered to be the oldest of the Greek poets, before Hesiod, although it's widely agreed they were around about the same time. But there are some scholars who argue that actually Hesiod was around first, and that it was only later that Homer came to be viewed as coming before Hesiod. Now interestingly, if you look at the Wikipedia page for Hesiod, then you'll see it claims Greeks in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BC considered their oldest poets to be Orpheus, Musaeus, Hesiod, and Homer in that order. But thereafter, Greek writers began to consider Homer earlier than Hesiod. Now what's interesting about this is that this is actually complete nonsense, and if you continue reading the article, then the evidence that it actually provides contradicts the previous paragraph, this paragraph. So the very next paragraph says, the first known writers to locate Homer earlier than Hesiod were Xenophanes and Heraclides Ponticus. This is true. The earliest source for the idea that Homer was earlier than Hesiod comes from Xenophanes, or at least that's as far back as we can trace the tradition. So what did this ancient source say about Homer, and how far back does it go? Well, what Xenophanes said was, since from the beginning everyone learned from Homer, so that's the key part, okay? So he considered Homer to be the earliest Greek poet, the earliest writer to convey stories about Greek mythology. He is the one from whom everyone else learned, so that would include Hesiod. And we see supporting evidence for this in the writings of a later writer, Aulus Gellius of the 2nd century CE. He was a Roman writer, and he explained that some wrote that Homer was older than Hesiod, for example, Philochorus and Xenophanes. So again, we see that the evidence shows that Xenophanes considered Homer to be earlier than Hesiod. Now, when was Xenophanes writing? Well, he lived from 570 until 478. Now, we don't know exactly when he wrote these words, but the balance of probability is that it was within the 6th century, because that was when by far the majority of his life took place. So the 6th century BCE would be the earliest trace of this tradition that Homer was earlier than Hesiod. So it goes back to at least as early as the 6th century BCE. Now, in contrast, what is the earliest trace of the tradition that Hesiod came before Homer? Well, the answer is that we can trace it back to a certain Ephorus of Kyme. He was a historian who lived from about 400 to 330 BCE, and according to him, Homer was a younger contemporary of Hesiod. He was actually a younger cousin of him. Now, as well as Ephorus, there's also some supposed evidence from an ancient story called the Contest of Homer and Hesiod, also known as the Certamen from its Latin name. Now this, as the title suggests, describes a contest, a poetic contest, between Homer and Hesiod. Now in this narrative, Hesiod is the first one to speak, and then Homer challenges him. So that's been interpreted as evidence that Hesiod was considered to be older than Homer, so he was given the dignity of going first. Now an important question is, when does this date to? The Certamen specifically dates to the 2nd century CE, but there's evidence that the story actually comes from much earlier than that, and that it was being told at least as early as the 4th century CE. But even so, it still dates to after Xenophanes, considerably later than him, actually, probably 2 centuries after he wrote. So we can see clearly it's still the case that Xenophanes is the earliest trace of any kind of claim about who was first, Homer or Hesiod. And since he was decidedly earlier, his evidence has a lot more weight than any of the other evidence. And this isn't just an outlier, an early record that is contradicted by all the other references. This is the earliest belief, as far as we can tell, and it's also the most common belief. Now, what Wikipedia says, like I said, is complete nonsense. It's not the case at all that Greeks in the late 5th and early 4th centuries considered Hesiod to be older than Homer, and then afterwards Greek writers began to consider Homer earlier than Hesiod. This is completely untrue. The earliest belief is that Homer was before Hesiod, and then some Greeks began considering Hesiod to be later. Now, another angle that we could take to examine who was earlier than who, or who came first, is the issue of language. So linguistic analyses have been done on the works of Homer and the works of Hesiod. Now, what's interesting is that there is a difference, a perceptible difference, between the language of the Iliad and the language of the Odyssey. So both of them allegedly were written by Homer. And we can see how there seems to be a slight evolution in the language, the use of Homer's language, by the time he gets to the Odyssey. And since the Odyssey was logically written later, because it speaks about events after the fall of Troy, whereas the Iliad is based before the fall of Troy, it makes sense that we would see a slight evolution in the language being used by Homer. However, the differences in language between Homer's Iliad and Hesiod's Theogony are 5 times greater than the differences between Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. So this suggests if the differences in language between the Iliad and the Odyssey represent a slight evolution in language, and the Theogony has a difference in language 5 times greater than that, then that suggests that the Theogony was written after, decidedly after, the Odyssey. So in other words, that suggests that Hesiod came later. So this is one of the arguments put forth to argue that Hesiod was after Homer. Personally, I'm not too much of a fan of this argument because I think, well, language is a very fluid thing. It's not like one static object that existed in one concrete form all throughout the Greek world at any one time. At any given moment, just like in English, for example, in England, which is a relatively small area compared to the Greek world, Homer wasn't even in Greece, it's obvious that there would be multiple dialects at any one time. So even within the same dialect, different families would have, they would raise their children in different ways with different backgrounds, different education, so we wouldn't expect their language to be identical. Even today, if someone has a certain background, they might use more antiquated language than someone of a different background within the same region. So we can't use this. I mean, I wouldn't like to use this as any kind of definitive evidence that Hesiod was younger than Homer. I think this is rather weak evidence. But nevertheless, it's the evidence that we have. So in the absence of any linguistic evidence to the contrary, we do have to admit that the linguistic evidence does weigh more towards the side of Homer being older rather than Hesiod being older. Although I would emphasize it's not very strong, it's not definitive evidence, but nevertheless, it's the evidence that we have. So on the linguistic side of things and the historical side of things, both of them point to this same conclusion that Homer was earlier than Hesiod. Homer, therefore, among the Greek poets whose works have survived, Homer would appear to be the earliest, the oldest, the most ancient of the Greek poets. Now, if you'd like to learn about the forgotten Irish kingdom in Dark Age Britain, then come back next time for my next video.